Welcome, everybody, to the 8th episode of Two Minds, One Podcast.
Welcome,
My
welcome.
name is Raymond.
My name's Nathan.
And today, we have I think a couple good topics to talk about. I learned something.
What'd you
I
learn?
know it came out probably a little bit ago. Some people might know it already. That 42 out of the 43 presidents, or I don't know, we might be past the 43 now at this point. The majority of the presidents are direct descendants of King John of England, who
Huh.
ruled between 1199
Mm-hmm.
to 1216
Okay.
AD, right?
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So
Do you think that's a funny coincidence, or do you think it's a more of a human population like
immigration thing?
Yeah, because
So
we know that majority of the initial population of the United States came from Britain, and you have some Dutch, and then later, we had more migratory, from the eastern, southern parts of Europe, right? But the initial,
was
people
from England.
and
Yeah.
those initial people were the ones that had the hardest time, but also had the easiest time in generating wealth and influence in a newly developing country.
Yeah. So I don't know. I lean towards more likely that it's an immigration thing,
Mm-hmm.
right? But I do lean
Rather
to
than
that.
like a conspiracy.
I do. The
like-
conspiracy is interesting. It has a ring to me. You know what I mean?
But like
An interest. When I say,
but let's be real.
it would be very difficult to prove that. To prove that, essentially, by saying that it's a bloodline thing, that means that all our voting in America has been for crap. It's all for show, and in the background, they just actually elect the person with the most direct bloodline percentage to King John, per se, right? Like, that would be insane. Now, not saying that is not possible, right? It's ridiculous.
No. It's too ridiculous to be possible, in my humble opinion.
It's real. Now,
I
if
think
you
it's
go
a
to the immigrant
happenstance.
thing,
I think it's a happenstance coincidence.
I do question one thing, though.
No, hear me out. I think it just has to be happenstance, because if you go far enough back in everybody's bloodline, you're eventually related to them.
Yeah, Obama was like 25th. So Obama was related to him, Barack Obama, and King John was his 25th great grandfather.
You see what I mean?
Right? Okay, but
it's like Genghis Khan.
But Genghis Khan ruled for longer. So the immigrant thing, I believe. Now, this guy must have been.
But Genghis Khan was also before him, because he was like 500 or 600.
So King John must have been real busy with them ladies in 17 years to be able to have that many descendants.
Yeah.
You think about it. You're talking about 40-some plus people.
But you're not. It's so easy to branch off, though, because even if he had 3 children, and each one of those children had 3 children, because there was a lot of people had a lot of kids back in the day, right? Significantly more than now, right? And those children had.
Yeah, what was the average number? Like 5 back in the day, something like that. When
a lot.
When we were mostly farmers, it was like 5 plus.
Funny enough, when food was more difficult, we had more children. But it's also
because you had children to help on the farm.
But
they weren't a burden. They were a production. They were an asset.
Not a burden. Them a burden, dude.
Not a burden, but
children always make things difficult.
But financially, in the sense,
they were still financially a burden, not a burden. But
no, because you would grow more food because you had more people, and to help you grow more food.
I guess.
Farm.
I guess that's
I read the study about it, so that's
I don't know.
Why.
I don't know. I can't claim to know much about that, but I do know that on average, people had more children back then.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's just because on average, having one child wasn't always guaranteed to make it to adulthood, just because of life expectancy and the difficult living conditions. So Having more children meant having a higher likelihood of your lineage continuing, which makes sense. Harder living times, right? But if you go far enough back on anybody's, ancestry, we're all going to be related eventually. Because I'm not sure if you know this, but there is...
Well, most people on that side of the world, yes.
All people of all of the world, because we're all humans and we all evolved from the same original...
I mean, yeah, if you go that far back.
That's what I'm saying. It all depends on how far you go back.
We all started in Africa, right? Or something like that.
Not supposedly. We did all start in Africa, right? So, inside your mitochondria, you have mitochondrial DNA. And this mitochondrial DNA is passed down from your mother. Only from your mother, not from your father, right? So, researchers did a study, and they found that all people, when they looked at all the gene sequences that they have in their database, right, and they took their mitochondrial DNA, all people mitochondrial DNA, when you go look at it, go back to this one genetic sequence. And this one genetic sequence, it's the same sequence that we all have, meaning all people on the planet today are related to this mitochondrial Eve, is what they call her, because it's the only way that you can get that DNA piece is being related to your mother. And so every current living human stems from that one living ancestor, or not living, that dead ancestor, right? So what I'm saying is,
how far back would that be? If you think, because
we're talking,
we have Homo sapiens, you have the barbarians.
You're talking
barbarians. I'm talking about that's far.
It's far, but like I said, you go far enough back in anybody's ancestry, you're going to be related.
Yes,
right? Because ultimately, to have the number of humans that are on the planet today with the average starting number of humans that evolved, sorry to break it to you guys, incest had to have occurred.
Oh no, incest. We know incest occurred,
but which means that we all came from this one mitochondrial Eve. Obviously, could have had different fathers, etc., but we all have that same mitochondrial DNA.
That brought up a question to me right now.
What?
If we had, incest nowadays will produce children with problems, right? With genetic problems, right? You can get Down syndrome. You can get other defects, physical defects, blood.
Yes,
right?
Yes.
Okay. Now, do you think, the question that came to mind, do you think that is more now because we are much more, as a race, diversified, I guess, less close, less in perfection of the same genes?
I don't know, man.
Because if that happened back then, during the time when incest was probably more common, right, to grow.
Not probably more common. It was common.
Yeah.
Even the times of kings and
queens. I'm just saying more common, right?
Yeah.
Then they would have a lot of problems. I'm talking about way before the kings. I'm talking about when we were still cavemen and monkeys. Just evolved from monkeys in sense, okay?
Well, yeah. No, those problems didn't exist.
So it must mean, that's what I'm saying. At that time, the blood was cleaner, or not cleaner, more like purebred dogs. In a sense, right?
I am not an expert in.
No, I know. I'm not asking you. I'm just telling you the question that came to my mind.
I understand your question. I understand where you're going.
It's interesting to find that answer.
You're going to the fact that nowadays incest equals problems. Yes. Back in the day, it seems like, based on historical data, did not equal problems, or as quickly, or as severe problems.
Yes, or as severe problems.
Is it possible that something changed along the way?
That's something. That's not something.
I don't know.
It's possible that something changed.
But
because remember when we went to San Diego?
I don't know when San Diego.
No, when we went down to San Diego, and we stayed, and we went to that museum, the Human Museum in San Diego, and it showed upstairs. It had a history of the human, right? The human. Homo sapien, which is us now. No, we're
Homo sapien sapien.
Homo sapien sapien. Okay, so I had the history of the Homo sapien sapien, and it went all the way back to the different lines of humans of our species, all the way back, and all these ended up blending, right? Like, what now I would like to know is further back than that? The history beyond that. Where did
I'm sure there's a
that?
lot of people that would like to know the history beyond that. I think there's an
You know what
entire
I mean?
field called
I know.
anthropology
Yeah,
that involves trying to figure out that
that's
question.
what I'm saying, because I
right?
know that there was the what were they called? You had the homos, which were more related to us, and then you had the the
The Neanderthals?
the Neanderthals, and then other subspecies of Neanderthals, and they would mix with us.
Yes, it's
Right?
evident in the Neanderthal DNA found in people
In
nowadays
people, okay.
when compared to fossils, not fossilized, but frozen.
Yeah, Neanderthal.
Yeah.
Okay. So where did they come from? If we're all related, then if you go that far back, we're all ended up being related, then the Neanderthals would end up coming from the same place as well.
Yes. That's
You know
what I'm telling you.
So
That's what I've been trying to tell you. The mitochondrial Eve tells us we all come from the same original tribe
so slowly
of Homo sapiens, or even before that, monkeys that were evolving, apes that were evolving to humans, right?
Or it could just be the apes themselves.
Right. We come from that one original clique that then went and spread out. And then mingled, and then spread out, and mingled, and spread out. Right? Which brings me up to the topic. Recently watched a documentary on the Genghis Khan.
Oh.
Yeah, interesting guy, actually.
Yeah, I heard he gave birth to like thousands of children.
So his DNA was passed off.
No, I heard that he himself gave birth to thousands because he would go to villages, rape women, they would get pregnant, and have his kids. Not that he, not the kids from his wife. Okay, I'm talking about just spreading his DNA.
His DNA is present in many, many people nowadays. I'm sure it's in the millions. But I learned something interesting about him. This wasn't so much as to his sexual escapades, but more as into his conquest and
his strategy for his conquest.
His history.
Okay.
Just not even his
history.
Okay. His history. So, fun fact, the name Genghis Khan is not actually his name. That is the name his people called him. Because he is the man who united the Mongolian people. So, a little bit of a history lesson for you. The Mongolians originally were
from? Oh, I don't know.
Or they're from the near Asian continent.
Okay.
So, for history, the Chinese continent, right, that we know as China now, right? Mongols are right next to it. If I remember correctly from the map, they were in the north
Let's
side.
Look it up.
Right.
Continue.
But the Mongolian people were nomadic tribal people, right? Similar to the traditional nomadic Indians that we saw here in North America prior to, European settlers. And they were always under constant fighting with each other, right? So the Mongolian people had never really united because they were always pitted against each other. And the people pitting them against each other were the Chinese. Interestingly enough, history, right? And they were doing so to make sure that they would never unite and never become an issue or a problem to their empire.
So they kept them
fighting each other
so that they wouldn't
disputes. So they wouldn't unite.
Yeah, okay.
So
because there was a lot of them.
Yes. So Genghis Khan, whose original name escapes me at the moment. So fun fact: his father was actually a very wealthy man in one of these tribes.
Okay.
But his father was killed, and his family left to die. And he, at an early age, he found and saw that wealth can help you solve problems, but wealth doesn't give you power. With power, you can gain wealth, but wealth will not lead you to power. So to him, the most important thing is power. And he learned that at a young age. And so with that knowledge, he spent many, many of his adolescent, young adult, and middle-aged years in pursuit of one thing and one thing only: power.
quick answer. You say you don't know his real name?
Yeah.
Well, you didn't remember his real name. His original name, Temujin.
Yes. Yes.
Temujin.
So, Genghis
born
Khan.
in 1162.
Yes.
So slightly before King John.
Before King John, bro.
Yeah.
Um,
Technically, they could have overlapped in lifespan.
They probably
They
did.
could have, right? I mean, depending on how long
he died in
the lifespan.
He died in 1247, I think, or 1227. Genghis Khan.
Oh, then they overlapped.
He died in 1227.
Because King John died in 1216.
So back into this, he learned at an early age that wealth doesn't matter. The only thing that matters in this world is true, utter power. And so he set upon that path. And along that path, he did what no Mongolian person had ever done before. He united every single tribe of the Mongolian people, right? Under a single banner, under a single nation. And he understood. This man, I believe, from what I read and what I saw in the documentary, this man he's depicted as a savage many a time because of his actions, and what his armies did were very barbaric and savage. But man, was he a genius leader. Unfortunately, the Mongolian people did not have a written history like Julius Caesar or Napoleon Bonaparte as before them, so everything that we know is of secondhand accounts. But what we do know is that he united the people, and he understood that old problems of their people, for example, your village raided my village and killed my brother, those problems needed to be quelled. And the fastest way to unite individual people together is to give them a common cause.
Give them a common enemy.
A common enemy, a common cause, a goal that they can unite and become brothers in arms in. So what he did, knowing that the Chinese would always put the Mongolian people against each other, he, in retaliation for all the years of abuse, went into China and conquered Western China and then Eastern China. And then after that, he went off, right? And he had sent two of his people, right, to essentially the Middle Eastern Turkey area, which was another kingdom, to establish trade routes. Men were slaughtered. He then sent three essentially ambassadors. Two of the ambassadors were slaughtered on sight, and the third one was beheaded for a crowd. So, in this disrespect, he went and he conquered Turkey, and he conquered that area of the Middle East, right? Right?
In this disrespect.
In the disrespect, right? And so, in retaliation to that, and then during his time there, the western and eastern parts of China rebelled against him. And they refused to send him troops for his crusade. And so, he finished his crusade, turned around, and went and quelled those rebellions, and once again went through and raped, pillaged, and essentially tore apart the Chinese kingdom and subjugated them again. And this time, instead of leaving the leaders that were there before, his son, one of his grandchildren, was actually set and placed as the leader of the Chinese area and established one of the Chinese dynasties that ruled over China after his death. But one of the things that everyone always said that Genghis Khan did with the spoils of war was he always divided them up equally. And he never left anything for himself. Why? Because he learned at a young age that wealth means nothing in the pursuit of power. And one of the things that has always perplexed scholars is actually that. Why Genghis Khan never invaded India? It's right next to his territory of China, Pakistan, Turkey, all of that area. But he never invaded India.
Maybe because they never disrespected him.
So,
right?
The documentary said the current belief was that, because the current belief was that it seems that most accounts of Genghis Khan and his crusades were not of pointless violence and just
It
greed.
wasn't
And it
just to
wasn't
go
greed.
there
It wasn't
to take
greed
it
for
over.
wealth.
Yeah.
It was in retaliation for disrespect of what was done, right? So he invaded China out of retaliation for what was done to the Mongolian people for generations.
Yes.
He invaded, Pakistan and, Turkey out of retaliation for what was done to his people and not being
For
willing
murdering
to,
his ambassadors.
right? And he invaded China again the second time, right? In retaliation for the disrespect of not wanting to be continuing to follow his rule and subjugation,
Mm-hmm.
right? But in that second invasion of China, he died. He conquered Western China and then was moving towards Eastern China, and he died on the front lines. Of the cause, unknown. But his son, who was appointed the next Genghis Khan, did invade China and did subjugate them.
The rest of China?
The other, so it was,
Or the other east part
so
of China?
at that time, China was pretty much two large dynasties
Mhm.
of Western China and Eastern China,
Mhm.
right? And so he conquered them both. But the interesting thing was that he never cared about wealth, and they always questioned why he never invaded India. The reasons are that they believe is that they never did anything that was disrespectful to him, that warranted invasion or retaliation. And the other thing was that India is the birthplace of Buddhism, and the main religion in Mongolia now is Buddhism, and a lot of their cultural similarities stem from originally coming from the same group of people that just branched out. And so another reason they believe he never invaded India was because of the religious aspect and the similarities he felt with the Indian people to the Mongolian people. But that's of course just a theory, right? Because we won't know, we'll never know, right? But I thought it was interesting to see how Genghis Khan, when you look at the historical facts and not just the victim side of the storyline. Oh, he came in, he did things right. It depicts a different person, right? Because he gets a bad rap for being this
it might
evil
just
person.
be
Well, don't get me wrong. He did lead crusades to do a lot of
bad things,
right? But I mean, as much as any leader did bad things in war at the time,
a lot of leaders did,
right?
So I think it was more he's projected evil more because maybe the Chinese are trying to tarnish his name. More sense, maybe not the Chinese, or maybe the people that were conquered were trying to tarnish the name. But I mean, anybody at that time, I feel, would have done terrible things.
People have been doing terrible things since the dawn of modern civilization, and have continued to do terrible things. And unfortunately, it seems to be like they will continue to do them.
I watched this small documentary there. A small video mentioned that Genghis Khan would marry off his daughters to leaders of where he would conquer. Right? Like either small towns or small like little areas or conquered areas, right? He would marry the daughter off. Then he would send the king of that area he just conquered, that nation per se, right? A small one, off to war at the front lines to die.
To leave his daughter in charge.
To leave his daughter is in charge.
Pretty smart.
Yeah.
So, seems like Genghis Khan was a very bright individual because he did what no man ever did before him. He conquered China not only once but twice. He held the largest empire.
Did they actually try to go after Japan?
It's possible. I don't know. That wasn't mentioned in the video.
In the video you watched,
the documentary I watched, but yeah, it's a pretty interesting tale to view things from a different light. But I believe there was something else that you wanted to talk about.
Oh, the book.
Yeah. You say you recently started reading a book?
Yes, I recently started reading a book. The history. What was it called? I have it on my iPad.
I believe it's The History of Central Banking and the Enslavement of Mankind.
Yeah.
A little bit of a dramatic title.
Yes.
By Stephen Mitford Godson.
Yes, he is actually he's in the financial field from Africa.
Okay. From South Africa?
I don't remember what part of Africa. It might have been South Africa.
Okay.
All right. And it's mostly based, I think he wrote it in the sense for Africa to get away from central banking. Right? Because as we know, if you have central banking without a currency backed by something, they just print unlimited money.
They just generate money out of thin air.
Yeah, they just print money. And the people in government or people in control of the printer are the only ones that benefit from it. Truly. Right? At the end of the day, all the benefit goes to them. And so it starts out with a little bit of history on him saying how he thinks that Africa should not be, and he's been in the field for 20 plus years in the financial system. And then it goes into a little bit of a history of state banking. I've only made it to the first chapter, and in the first chapter, it goes a little bit of history about central banking, where it came from, who started it, and more history of state. What was the banking before? How trade currency started? Right? It was trade. It was cows.
It was trade. It was value.
It was basically trade. It was just trade. And then the Romans.
I think that's called the barter system.
Yeah, the barter system. Then the Romans created. Then the Romans started trading with weirdly shaped copper pieces.
Yes, they started their currency.
Their currency. That was like the first currency.
Yes. It was the
weirdly shaped copper pieces.
Yes, and it was and then the Romans started that because of their enormous empire.
Yeah, and then that grew into stamping the copper. Right, and then stamping other precious metals as
silver and gold. Right,
which weren't really currencies, right? Because they have a value. It was a rare metal, metal,
rare earth metal,
right? That has innate value.
Yeah, it has innate value because of how limited its supply is. Right?
Exactly. But that's as far as I got in that chapter.
Okay.
After that point is when I stopped reading and had to do some other things. But
for those of you that don't know, the United States does work on a centralized banking system. I'm sure you guys have heard of the Fed or the
Federal Reserve.
The Federal Reserve. It is the most powerful, I would say, one of the most powerful entities in the United States government. Funny enough,
it's not part of the government, though.
Most people think that the Fed is part of the government, but it's not. It's independent.
Yep.
Which is interesting. It's independent, and they work with the government to set up loan rates, interest rates, printing of money, when it gets rolled out, when it doesn't get rolled out, collection of old bills, coins, etc. The Fed is one of the most powerful economic entities, in the government.
It is the one. It's the one that creates the money that loans it to the government.
Yes. Which is interesting. So for those of you that don't know, the current Fed that we have in its truest form that we have now was set up in 1913. To be exact, it was called, Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act, or the Glass-Owen Act, as it's, named sometimes. In late 1913, President Wilson signed the act into law on December 23rd, 1913.
Damn, base, almost the end of the year.
Yes. 7 years before our Great Depression. So, if the Federal Reserve is such of was supposed to be this end all be all solution to the banking system.
Wasn't a senator from Rhode Island that went over to Europe and
Yes.
saw this central, which brought the idea over here?
So, speaking of,
Mm-hmm.
yes, you're talking about, I believe it was Senator Nelson Aldrich. That's the name of the senator, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, story goes that he went to Europe with a bunch of economic expertise to view the European banking system, specifically that of Britain and Germany, right? Because they had centralized banking systems at the time. The reason that he had gone to that is because prior in the nation's history, banking has always been of America. Okay. Banking has always been a big issue that the American government has been trying to solve. Originally, there was to be no centralized bank controlled by the government, and every state would have its own bank, but that led to every state having its own bank and its own currency. So eventually, it was decided that there would be one government bank.
State banking.
State banking, mm-hmm. Right? So that was demolished, and there was just government banking, which worked for a while, but then in the 1800s, it crashed, right? Which then led to...
Which is one of the weaknesses of state banking.
Right, which led to the implementation of essentially government banking. But no one trusted the government banking, so that failed. So went back to the decentralized state banking, which worked for a while.
With nationwide
with a nationwide currency.
So it
wasn't an individual currency, but what they did keep was the not having to worry about
different currencies
for different states,
yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the one thing that was left over from the government's attempt to establish a centralized banking system
mm-hmm.
was the currency, the U.S. dollar, backed by gold,
mm-hmm.
as all currencies were at the time.
So it wasn't a currency; it was money.
Money, currency is what people call it.
Yeah.
But currency is a distinction from money, right? So
mm-hmm.
that worked, but they did notice that there was issues with how the banking system was operating, and it led to...
Yeah, they had difficulties between transactions between states.
Right. It was banks. Actually the panic of 1907 that led to this issue being brought up again.
Okay. And what was the panic of 1907?
Right. It's a big ordeal. In early 1907, the New York Times Annual Financial Review published that its first official plan for a modified central banking, which outlined remedies that would avert essentially bank rushes because there was multiple banks that had failed due to people coming in and wanting to pull all their money out, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the senator...
So the 1907 was known as the bankers' panic, or the knuckle-broker crisis, right? The panic of 1907 was a financial crisis that took place in the United States over a 3-week period, started mid-October, when the New York Stock Exchange fell almost 50% from its peak previous year.
Yeah, there you go. So, things of that were issues, right? So, they needed a solution to their banking problem. So that's where they turned to Europe. 2 of the most affluent countries in Europe were Britain and Germany at the time, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they looked for their centralized banking systems, and they got their model, the current model that we have, from them. However, Aldrich did, the senator, place this into a plan in motion, but it took a lot of time to get its legs underneath this act to centralize banking to the United States. It wasn't until 1913, right? President Woodrow Wilson got it, and it's actually funny enough that when the Senate majority became Democratic, and it passed the bill, moving it towards the president, right? But we do know, anybody that knows a thing or two about history in United States history, we know that we have, in 1913, we have the centralized banking system. Cool. They think it's going to solve all the problems. They have no experience with it. So they're very
They didn't bring
experimental.
in experts, yeah.
They're very experimental with it. It's going to be very hit or miss until they figure things out.
It's learn on the fly.
Yes. And there's always the transition period, which with something large like this is going to span decades. Well, one of the repercussions of transferring to a centralized banking system was
the Great Depression.
The Great Depression. All of you know, and I'm sure if you took a history class, you remember the Great Depression being one of the worst financial times, or the worst financial time in United States history, right? So one of the things that led to that, right, was the experimentation of the Federal Reserve, right, which they experimented with essentially adding and subtracting money from the generalized system, right? So the way our banking system works is if, we have $100 and that gets spread out evenly throughout the country, right? We have a fractional reserve banking system, right? So when the bank receives $100, they can use 90% of that, right? And they can loan out to $90.
Yeah, they got to have a 10% reserve.
Right, and then that it gets loaned out to you. You get the $90, you deposit it into your bank, and then they can loan out the
other 90%.
90%, right? So that's how our banking system works, right? And so essentially, $100 can be turned into $10,000, right, through that system. But if everybody were to want to, for say, pull their money out at the same time, it wouldn't be enough.
No, you'd crash it.
It's just debt. This is what we're talking about. We're talking about debt creation. Well, the Federal Reserve experimented with destroying money, and what they mean by destroying money was pulling money out of the unified pool that's in play right now, right? Which isn't a big issue. Money in circulation, which isn't a big issue if people don't, go to the banks and want to pull their money. Well, the Federal Reserve had some of the worst timing.
The worst.
Because there was a bubble in the 1920s, in the 1900s, 1910s, leading to the 1920s, that had been forming. And
them putting money in the system.
Putting money in the system and inflating the system, and then they pulled money out of the system, which just led to an acceleration, a cascading effect of the 1920 crash. The stock market crash bubble, which was the greatest drop in the stock market ever, and led to the Great Depression, which was the years following that of economic hardships of the country and really a lot of rebuilding and regaining trust in the banking system. Right?
Yeah.
So, the Federal Reserve has had an interesting play in a lot of people's lives, whether they know it or not. Right? For example, we just recently went through the pandemic. The Federal Reserve printed billions of dollars.
Trillions of dollars.
Trillions of dollars for bailouts of companies, stimulation checks,
and who knows what else.
Who knows. And all their other policies, right?
Yeah.
Which I don't think in itself is inherently bad. I do think how it went about and how the money is managed, could have been better.
I do,
right? But
I do think they included some money in there that shouldn't have been.
Exactly.
But
that in turn has led to the large increase in inflation that we are experiencing now. The post and pre-pandemic economy that we're experiencing, right? Which is also a number of factors of, shutting down, the essentially large industries of supply chains and things of that nature, right? Which do not start back up. Do not just start back up.
They don't just start back where they left off.
Exactly.
You can't shut something down to zero and then expect it to go back to the same.
Yeah.
Not in that is also affecting inflation because things are still hard to receive.
Yes.
Right. And then add on that you had a war start, right? In Europe.
In Ukraine.
Right? So that adds extra stress on the supply chain. Right?
So,
because the world is so intertwined.
Yes. So up until the net reserve, right? At this point, even in the stock market crash, the U.S. dollar was still backed by gold. And as such, it was a safe trading commodity for the world to use as its reserve currency, which following World War I and World War II, the United States came out as the leading world power, right? So the US dollar was used as a safe way to hold currency and to be able to trade versus your country's
keep your
dollar.
value
Exactly.
against your country's
because it held its value
country,
well,
yeah.
right? And its inflation rate was relatively well controlled, right? In the 1970s, we changed.
Well, technically, they paused the gold standard.
They paused.
They just haven't unpaused it.
Exactly.
Since then.
So, in the 1970s, the US dollar went from being a currency backed by gold, right, to a currency backed by faith.
Yes.
In its innate value that it held with people's minds.
Do you know why
beliefs.
they ended up pausing it? You know why? Because at the time America was going to war, and they were
Vietnam,
printing.
Correct?
Yeah, they were printing a lot of money, and the other countries around the world were like, they didn't really trust that America had that much gold to back all the money it was printing to go to war. So they started trading in their money for gold bars. And then they started requesting their gold bars from America.
Yes, they wanted their
gold bars.
They wanted their value.
Gold. They wanted their value. Then the president at the time, I don't remember who it was.
I believe it was Nixon.
Maybe. I don't remember who it was. I'm sure we can look it up. Was like, nope, pause. We're not sending anybody any gold. We're taking the dollar off the gold standard. We're pausing the dollar off the gold standard in the meantime.
Yes.
Yes.
And that changed the entire course
to the type of currency
that changed the entire course of the U.S. dollar.
Yeah.
Yeah. From no longer being a currency backed by
it's no longer money that you could say. Now it is 100% currency.
Right.
It is
the thing is that most people believe to this day still believe that their dollar is backed by gold.
Yeah,
it's a common misconception.
They changed the bills too. The way the bills read. If you get a bill before 1970, which is pretty hard to find now because most of them have been destroyed, they don't say a Federal Reserve note. On them.
Yep.
They say a dollar.
Yeah.
So,
interestingly enough, the Federal Reserve holds so much power over your life, over what interest rate you're getting when you buy your house, what interest rate you're getting when you buy a car, even when you apply for a loan, how that is done. Another interesting thing that has developed, this is completely separate from
also makes it really hard to start a bank, by the way.
Yes.
Really capital intensive to start a bank because you have to join. It'll be approved by the Federal Reserve and whatnot.
Yes. But completely separate from the Federal Reserve and monetary system is going back to the supply chain shortages. One of the supply chain shortages that has affected the world the most is semiconductors. I'm sure you've heard. I'm sure everyone's heard at this point. Shortage of semiconductors, right?
Due to shutting down.
Due to production. And the world's leading semiconductor
pivoted.
No, the world's leading semiconductor manufacturer is Taiwan. Which is interesting if you know anything about geopolitics, because Taiwan, according to China, is a province of China. But the rest of the world, a large majority of the world, views it as its own independent nation.
Yes.
And according to China, it is not. It is just biding its time till it can be reintegrated into China. And this happened when the Communist Party of China won the Civil War of China, and the democratic leaders that the United States was backing fled to Taiwan. And when they tried to pursue them, the United States Navy flew over and said, "No, we see this country as its own country, this island as its own country." And then I forget the name of the man, but he had a genius idea. During this time was at the same time, similar time when the computer revolution was taking over the world. They knew that the computers were going to be more and more common, and semiconductors are the heart of the computer, right? The brain. And so he decided to create essentially a pact with the large Silicon Valley companies for saying, I will generate, you show me how to generate your semiconductors with your processes, and we'll do it over here in Taiwan where the labor is cheaper, right? But you still hold full control. And thus, the Taiwanese Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, or TSM, was born, right? Backed by the Taiwanese government, might I add, for its founding. So, now that the United States and China are essentially competing world powers, semiconductors are more important than ever. They're used in military vehicles. They're used in your missiles. They're used in satellites. They're used in cars, helicopters, airplanes, ships, phones, even gyroscopic drones.
They're used in everything.
They're used in everything.
Anything electronic.
As such, tensions in the Chinese Sea, where Taiwan is based, have been increasing. Why? Because China is also dependent upon these semiconductors, just as the United States is, and just as a large majority of the world is, right?
Weren't they just banned from buying these now? From American-made
yes.
American. Right?
American.
Quotations.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the reason being was because they found that Chinese semiconductors that were being manufactured were at we'll say, stage 10 out of like the 12 stages, right? Or stage 7 out of 10 stages, right? And the difference in time that it takes to go from that level of semiconductor to the level of semiconductor that we have now is a long time. So, as such, the United States was like, well, our semiconductor plans, right, on how we design them and how they're made and special process and whatnot, right, is far more advanced than them, so we're still okay with this. But then China had a jump. And they learned that, I believe, it was due to essentially reverse engineering United States semiconductors, right?
Yeah, because there's no copyright laws in China. And that's what you see a lot of.
Right. And so, if I remember correctly, yes, American companies are banned from selling to China any item that has an American designed semiconductor in it, which is interesting because this has led to increasing tensions between the United States and China, which has led to China wanting to, and informing Taiwan that it has the military might to invade if it so chooses, which has also increased the tensions in that neighbor of the world with Japan. Japan is right next to China and provides a strategic location for the United States, right?
And it's still military bases there.
Yes, because Japan and the United States are allies, and they work closely together. Japan, fun fact, just recently, which considered a pacifist country, has just reinterpreted its constitution and has increased its military spending budget. It has doubled from 1% to by 2030 or 2025 to be 2%. And why is it doing that? Because it understands that tensions are rising in the South China Sea, and that conflict is a high possibility in this area because China doesn't. This is something in the United Nations, in the world, right? There is the maritime law where it says you, as a country, own, if I remember correctly, 70 to 100 miles of ocean off of your coast. Everything after that is international waters. China doesn't abide by that. China believes that it owns the South China Sea, and all of the South China Sea is its property, which leads to conflict when you have Chinese vessels moving into territories of, for example, Japan, Philippines, Taiwan, and areas of that, and imposing their will and essentially bullying them to leave that area and go fish somewhere else, affecting other countries' economies, etc. So these tensions have been rising, and as such, the United States has just put a plan in to increase its presence in China, in Japan, and in areas around in the Chinese Sea, right? So if you notice in a world map, Japan isn't just the main island. It has many of those smaller islands. And the United States is going to be building more bases in those smaller islands. But the interesting thing is, this is a blatant show of, hey, we're here and we're going to be here, which can be considered an escalation when viewed from the Chinese perspective, which can either do one of two things. They can either show China that, this issue will be pressed and they should not press this issue, right? And they'll, the plan will do what it's supposed to do, is just establish itself as a deterrent.
De-escalate a little bit.
Or
escalate.
It could do the opposite.
Yeah.
Escalate, and it can be seen as an attack. And it can be seen from the Chinese perspective that right now, before all of this new infrastructure, stations, military bases are set up, now is the time to go into action.
But China can't. It'd be difficult right now for China. China's having economic problems too. The housing market. They're having a humongous housing market problem.
But guess what? One of the greatest
banking problem.
But guess what? One of the greatest solutions to, and guess one of the greatest money makers ever known to man is war.
Yeah. But now when your banking sector
one of the
is
greatest
having
things
they have run on banks in China.
One of the greatest things to help
a little different.
The United States come out of the Great Depression was its manufacturing and supporting of World War II and supporting its allies.
World War I, you mean, to get out of the Great Depression?
Yeah, sorry, World War I. No, World War II. World War I was before. It was 1910s, 13s, 14s.
Was it?
Yes. World War II is started in 1937 or 36.
Yeah, the late 1930s.
Yes. So and
World War II, yeah.
So World War II.
Mm-hmm.
And their manufacturing of just artillery and shells for the Allies, Britain, etc., and the Allied powers, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it was pacifist because it was asked to help for many times. It wasn't until essentially
Japan attacked,
and many United States cruiser ships were attacked by German submarines.
Mm-hmm.
It was that, in conjunction with the attack on Pearl Harbor, that finally decreed and brought the United States into World War II. But it's interesting how something so small, the supply chain, how the dominoes fall. The supply chain falls, semiconductor shortage. Who gets priority semiconductors? Taiwan is the
semiconductor shortage was caused because they stopped manufacturing of a certain type of chip that was widely used. Chips. No, on all chips, but there was the most popular one, which was a very old style one that was used. Then they shifted because they needed to keep making money. They shifted to a more advanced type of chip and started selling that. And then the orders started coming in for the old, and they couldn't because they changed their whole process, and now their semiconductors ended up in
the point is semiconductors and Taiwan.
Sorry for my language.
Semiconductors in Taiwan are a large focal point of the next 5 to 7 years of politics and tension, right? If the United States is not careful, or if China is not careful, the probability of war in South China Sea is very high. Do I think it's going to happen? No, because China does seem, based off its previous past experience, seem to try to de-escalate situations like this diplomatically before resulting to
war.
To war.
Why do you think that is, though?
Because they understand that war with the United States has a high probability of escalating. And it's not just war with the United States.
It's war with the UN.
It's war with, essentially, not the UN, with NATO, which is all of the United States allied
nations.
Yeah. Right? We're talking France, we're talking Britain, we're talking Australia, Japan, right? Germany, and it's big. It's big. So yeah, that's just something I wanted to bring up. I
Yeah, well, it's
believe,
kind of funny that we went from the central banking
yeah,
to
but
that.
it's just something in geopolitics that came up that I thought was very interesting. But I do believe that is all the time we have for today. So, if you guys enjoyed the episode, leave a like, comment, maybe, tell us something we don't know about the centralized banking system,
Oh,
or,
that's funny.
about the, political situation of the world currently. So,
That's my mistake. Before we leave, I got to correct. China is part of the UN, and they are actually one of the founding members of the
yes.
United Nations. And yeah,
Yeah, they're part of the UN.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, they're having trouble getting their seat back in the UN, I guess, right now.
Well, that's a different political issue that.
Yeah, we can talk about that maybe some other time.
But yeah,
Just to mention it, yeah. All
thank
right,
you for your
guys.
time, guys.
Thank you, and we'll see you next week.
Yep.
Bye.